Welcome to Reformed Thinking, the deep dive where we take specific source material articles, research, historical data, and distill that information to gain a precise understanding of critical theological texts.
Our mission today is to step directly into the world of the first century Roman Church. We're placing ourselves in Rome in AD 57, the exact historical and cultural context surrounding Paul's letter to the Romans, right when Phoebe was preparing to carry that letter across the Mediterranean.
And our goal for you, the listener, is really to provide a shortcut to truly grasping this colossal letter. We want you to see the world Paul was addressing, the political dominance, the social stratification, the harsh reality of life in the capital.
Right, so you could appreciate why Paul wrote Romans the way he did and why his message was so utterly radical.
And this context is absolutely essential for understanding the central principles of Reformed theology. Romans stands as Scripture's clearest articulation of God's complete authority over human affairs, the scope of universal human sin, and of course, the mechanics of justification by faith alone.
These concepts, which, inform standards like the Westminster Confession, they just gain their full weight when you contrast them with the Roman worldview.
Absolutely. Rome pursued self-justification through concepts like imperial honor, military victory, domination. When we understand that Paul's proclamation of divine righteousness, a righteousness provided solely through Christ and received by faith, it just takes on a completely new dimension.
It really does. He wasn't just fixing a theological problem. He was, in a way, inverting the whole social and political order.
Okay, let's unpack this setup and jump into the overwhelming physical and political reality of the Roman Empire in the mid-first century.
When Paul was writing, Rome was undeniably the center of the known world. We are looking at a system that stretched from Britain, Gaul, and Spain in the west,
All the way across the Mediterranean.
reaching as far as Syria in the east, from the Danube River in the north to the deserts of African coasts in the south.
It was not just a vast territorial holding, right? It was this complex network of tributaries and provinces.
And allied states, all orbiting the central power of Rome. And that sheer scale, it just dictated the ruling class's philosophy. They held an unshakable belief that they ruled by divine decree.
And that all these conquered lands and peoples existed for one singular purpose: to maintain and enhance Rome's central interests.
Exactly. And the sources show that this wasn't just practical administration. This was an ideology of inherent Roman superiority.
So they truly believed they were better than everyone else, and the gods had basically signed off on their right to control the world.
That conviction is laid bare in a specific historical anecdote we find from AD 58. It involves Avitus, the Roman prefect of Germany.
Okay, what happened there?
A desperate German leader approached Avitus requesting help for a starving, displaced tribe.
Hmm.
This tribe asked for nothing more than to be allowed to settle on a strip of their own ancestral land along the Danube,
Land the Romans weren't even using.
land the Romans were currently leaving vacant. You would think that simple, non-threatening request might be met with some basic pragmatic charity, right?
Especially since the land was unused. But Avitus refused, flatly.
He did. And the reason given wasn't based on an immediate military threat or anything like that. It was based on this ideological conviction of Roman destiny.
It was an exercise in power rooted in this perceived cosmic entitlement.
That's it. He asserted that the Romans were simply superior to this German tribe, and therefore the gods had given the Romans control over that territory, even if they weren't using it.
To give it away would be to dilute the glory and the mandate Rome had been given. Wow. It turns a political refusal into a kind of theological statement about destiny.
Yes. So when we look at the goals of conquest, we have to understand them through this lens. The objectives were glory and spoil.
The honor and comfortable survival of Roman citizens in, entertaining surroundings.
Exactly. The expansion wasn't seen as a burden. It was a right, a means to feed the center. And this ideology led directly to horrifying brutality, which we see demonstrated clearly in the Armenian campaign of AD 58.
These are events taking place right as Paul was preparing this letter.
Right at the same time, General Corbulo viewed King Tiridates' attempt to retake his land as a direct challenge to the grandeur of Rome.
So Corbulo didn't just need a victory. He needed a display of power.
A massive display. He moved against a fortress town called Volandum, and the sources, specifically Tacitus, report the results with this cold efficiency.
Duh.
Every single adult was murdered.
Every adult.
Everyone. The surviving children were immediately rounded up and auctioned off as slaves. This is the immediate human consequence of the pursuit of Roman glory.
Unbelievable.
But the campaign's actions become even more revealing when they reached Artaxata, the capital. The population, seeing the writing on the wall, surrendered. They offered the Roman soldiers all their property.
So they essentially ceded the territory. By all accounts, the campaign goals, territorial control, and spoil should have been achieved.
You'd think so.
Wait, if they surrendered and offered their goods, why didn't Corbulo just occupy the city? That seems like the most logical, resource-efficient option for maintaining control.
That's the question that forces us to look past practical necessity and into the concept of imperial honor. Tacitus gives a two-part explanation. First, Corbulo claimed he couldn't spare the troops for an occupation force.
Okay, that sounds plausible, I guess.
But the second part is the key. Tacitus writes that if the city were left nearly captured and unguarded, no advantage or glory would accrue from its capture.
So if capturing the city didn't sufficiently elevate Roman honor, the city itself had no intrinsic value. That's an insane rationale.
It is. Corbulo ordered Artaxata to be fired, demolished, and leveled to the ground. A city full of people who had surrendered and given up their property was utterly destroyed because its preservation offered insufficient glory to the Roman general and the empire.
And the sources even provide the religious justification for this, don't they?
They do. The religious coda for this destruction. Tacitus, the Roman elite, notes that a massive thunderstorm descended right after the city was torched.
Which was immediately interpreted as celestial confirmation.
Exactly. The gods Jupiter, specifically, were confirming that the destruction was justified because heaven was wroth against it. It connects Roman brutality explicitly to their religious self-justification.
So mass murder and the total destruction of a city are framed as a pious act, sanctioned by the divine. This is a society where the highest good is Roman self-glory.
That's the world. And this is exactly why Paul's message in Romans is so confrontational. If Roman life is centered on acquiring and maintaining honor through conquest and violence, Paul arrives and says, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God.
He just levels the playing field. No amount of imperial conquest or personal honor can achieve the true glory that comes from God. That contrast, that really sets up the whole theological structure of the letter.
That Roman glory and conquest had a constant, crushing human cost, and that cost fed directly into the core economic and social structure of the city. Slavery.
Right. The Armenian children we just discussed were just part of a constant stream of human spoil entering the capital.
And we have evidence that the slave population was immense. The sources show that the sales tax on slaves was significant enough to be a central part of Nero's tax reform plan in AD 56.
So we're not talking about a fringe population. We're talking about a massive labor force that was basically propping up the capital.
Absolutely. And the casual, objectifying nature of this system is so evident in Nero's Great Festival, held a year later to celebrate the eternal success of the empire. Suetonius describes the lavish gifts distributed to the citizens.
I remember this list. Nero distributed thousands of assorted birds, food parcels, vouchers for goods. Then we see the list. Grain, clothes, gold, silver, pearls, paintings, and transport animals.
And right in the middle of that list of inanimate objects and livestock.
Slaves. They are literally itemized as disposable property alongside paintings and beasts of burden.
It's chilling. And as the sources suggest, it is entirely possible that some of these slaves, distributed or auctioned off in Rome in AD 57, were the children taken captive by Corbulo in Armenia just months prior.
And we have that painful visualization of this trade. Like the relief on the triumphal arch in Tripoli, which depicts the anguished face of a young boy taken as war booty.
That face really encapsulates the agony that the elite historians just dismiss in a single sentence.
It provides the required sobriety. While servitude varied wildly from privileged household servants to brutalized field workers, the consensus from the source material is that abuse was widespread and normalized.
Seneca, the Stoic philosopher, he offers us a grim window into this reality while attempting to counsel restraint among elite owners.
But he wasn't trying to abolish slavery or even reform it on moral grounds, was he?
Not at all. He was simply urging the elite to maintain stoic restraint and calm. He asks his audience, why are we in such a hurry to flog him at once, to break his legs forthwith?
That phrase alone shows that instantaneously breaking a slave's legs was a very real, very common, almost unthinking response to minor disobedience.
Yes. He also discouraged calling for the whip in the middle of dinner parties simply because the slaves were conversing or being noisy.
Which tells us that random, extreme physical violence was an accepted immediate reaction for those who ruled the Roman household.
And we can connect this brutality to the physical evidence we find in the archaeological record. Near Vesuvius, we have the skeletons of a 14-year-old girl and a baby.
And her bones showed clear signs of strenuous activity, right? Like she was running up and down many flights of stairs or hills constantly.
Constantly. And alongside that evidence of relentless physical strain, her dental records pointed to severe malnutrition.
So you get this picture of a young girl, overworked and starving, existing just a couple hundred miles from the imperial capital where Nero was distributing slaves as party favors. It really shows the hidden economic engine of imperial life.
Now, despite this brutal system, movement was possible. Many slaves obtained freedom through manumission or by purchasing their freedom, creating the large social class of freedmen and freedwomen.
But this freedom came with strings attached.
Huge strings. They retained specific lifelong responsibilities to their former masters, mostly centered on upholding that master's social status and dignity.
These freedmen became clients, expected to participate in the salutatio, the morning call on the master. Then they'd accompany the master through the city, forming a public retinue.
And the bigger your retinue of clients, the greater your public honor. It was a visible system of reciprocal obligation.
This inherent tension between freedom and obligation, it boiled over in the Senate debate in AD 56.
It did. Some senators argued fiercely for the right to retract freedom from surly freedmen who publicly insulted their former masters. The argument was that the freedmen were damaging the master's honor, and therefore the foundation of their freedom should be dissolved.
It was a very close call, from what I understand.
It was. However, the Senate realized they couldn't afford to grant that power. They concluded that if masters could arbitrarily retract freedom, it would pose a greater threat to civil order than a few rude freedmen.
And the reason for that realization is what makes the debate so important, isn't it?
Absolutely. Freedmen were indispensable. They held crucial positions across government, religious life, the military, and commerce. Tacitus, the historian, even remarked that many knights and senators trace their lineage back to this same origin.
So the city literally could not function without the massive productive power of the formerly enslaved population.
And beneath all the imperial politics and the systems of patronage, the majority of Romans, slave, freed, or freeborn, were focused simply on survival. Life was short.
Only about 7% of the population reached age 60, and children frequently died young.
This intense pressure cooker led to desperate measures, including the frequent practice of abandoning or murdering unwanted children, a practice known as expositio.
And the Stoic philosopher Musonius Rufus, who was rare in his criticism, pointed out that even well-off people did this so that their earlier-born children would be better off.
Which means the pressure to manage limited resources was constant, even at high social levels. This constant struggle created a zero-sum game mentality.
If resources were so scarce, then a neighbor's success was often perceived as a depletion of your own available luck.
So actively working against your neighbor or trying to diminish their success became a rational act of self-preservation.
We see the crushing stress of this existence distilled into a single grave inscription. I think this is so telling.
It's heartbreaking. The epitaph reads, "Bones reposing sweetly, I am not anxious about suddenly being short of food. I do not suffer from arthritis, and I am not indebted because of being behind in my rent. In fact, my lodgings are permanent and free."
That inscription is just a profound indictment of Roman society. Security, freedom from debt, and permanent lodging, the things people struggled for every single day, were only found when life's anxieties ceased in death.
And the zero-sum desperation is what Paul's message of selfless, unified love in Romans 12 directly confronts.
Given that harrowing economic backdrop, let's consider the physical environment these early Roman Christians inhabited. Most Romans, certainly the non-Lite, lived in multi-story apartment blocks called insulae.
That's right. These structures could reach 5 stories, though usually 3 or 4 were typical. The ground floor of an insula was typically commercial space shops and taverns.
And sometimes the shop owner lived in a low, dark mezzanine level right above their shop.
Right. And as you moved up the building, the rent dropped drastically, but so did the standard of living.
The structural hazards of the upper floors were severe. Juvenal, the satirist, famously described the constant danger of fire. He noted that the person living on the 3rd floor, protected only by a little roof tile, would be the last to burn.
Why? Because they wouldn't hear the alarm until the fire was already sweeping upwards from the crowded lower levels?
It's terrifying to think about. And beyond fire, the practical amenities were just non-existent on the upper floors.
No internal heating, no kitchen facilities, and often no ready access to water. Latrines were typically communal or located only on the ground level for the businesses there.
Imagine having to carry heavy water up 3 or 4 flights of narrow stairs multiple times a day.
And Martial, the poet, described his third-floor apartment as so cold that Boreas, the god of the north wind, wouldn't even consider spending the night there. These were small, dark, difficult spaces to inhabit.
So since the living quarters were so harsh and cramped, people spent very little time indoors.
Exactly. Life in Rome was, by necessity, communal and external. You had to be out in the streets, markets, and public spaces constantly.
This environment made social networking essential for survival. People joined trade guilds, clubs, collegia, and religious associations.
And these weren't hobbies. They were lifelines, providing mutual aid, burial funds, and a social safety net that the state did not.
And since people of similar occupations tended to cluster in the same neighborhoods and apartment blocks, these essential social networks were ready-made.
If you were a dock worker, you lived near the docks. If you were a tanner, you lived near the tanneries. That created natural, localized gathering spaces.
This pattern was already well established by the time Christianity arrived, particularly among the Jewish community.
That's right. By the 1st century BC, they had organized multiple synagogues, such as the Synagogue of the Hebrews and others, named after important imperial figures like Augustus and Agrippa. They lived predominantly across the Tiber River in the Trastevere district.
Which demonstrates a pre-existing pattern of organized, localized group meetings, a structure the early church would naturally adopt.
Paul's letter, written in the mid-50s AD, is the earliest evidence we have for the Christian community in Rome. What's striking is that by this time, the community was already stable and famous.
He knew their faith was spoken of throughout the whole world. That's in 1.8. It speaks to its established nature, even though Paul had never visited.
And we can trace the probable route of the gospel into the city. It most likely followed the crucial east-west trade route, arriving through Puteoli.
Puteoli was Rome's busiest port and served as a cultural funnel, allowing ideas, people, and goods from the eastern Mediterranean to flow straight into the capital.
And it also housed one of the few large Jewish communities outside Rome in Italy, making it a perfect entry point.
The initial seeds were likely sown soon after the events of Pentecost.
I think so. Acts 2.11 lists visitors from Rome, both Jews and proselytes, who witnessed the coming of the Spirit and heard the gospel preached in Jerusalem. These people would have returned home and started preaching in their own local settings.
And we get a clearer picture of the very earliest missionaries through Paul's greetings in Romans 16. He names Andronicus and Junia,
calling them fellow Jewish Christians, well-known apostles, and stating specifically that they were in Christ before me.
That is a critical detail.
It really is. If they were followers of Christ before Paul's conversion, they would have become Christians perhaps in the early 30s AD, meaning they could have easily been among those Jewish believers who returned to Rome following Pentecost, spreading the message within their own community during the 30s or 40s AD.
This origin Christianity, starting within the Roman Jewish community, helps us understand the famous Claudius expulsion. Acts 18.2 mentions that Aquila and Priscilla had to leave Rome because Claudius commanded all Jews to depart from the city.
And we have the external, non-Christian account from Suetonius regarding this same period. He states that Claudius expelled the Jews because they were constantly making disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus.
Which, given the timeline, scholars see Chrestus as a garbled, confused reference to Jesus Christ.
Right. The disturbances weren't necessarily political revolts. They were intense internal theological conflicts breaking out within the Jewish synagogues due to the preaching that Jesus was the long-awaited Messiah.
But we have to be careful with the word expulsion, right? The edict was likely not rigorously enforced, or maybe was only temporary and selectively applied.
I think that's right. The Jewish population in Rome was enormous, possibly tens of thousands. Historians like Tacitus, who meticulously recorded every social upheaval, never mention a wholesale expulsion.
And Dio Cassius, another Roman historian, only mentions an earlier prohibition on Jewish meetings, saying a full expulsion would have caused too much disorder.
So while the edicts certainly caused high-profile figures, like Aquila and Priscilla, to flee, it didn't instantly empty the city of all Jews.
However, it likely did initiate a shift in the church's ethnic makeup.
A big one. When Paul wrote in the mid-50s, the church had become predominantly Gentile. Paul addresses them directly as Gentile believers in 1.56 and 11.13.
This shift wasn't entirely due to the expulsion, though. It was natural growth. Many Gentiles in Rome were already attracted to Judaism. They were God-fearers or spiritual seekers who liked the ethical monotheism of the Jewish faith.
And the gospel, grounded in Israel's scriptures, but offering a message of salvation open to all nations, was highly attractive to this group, causing their numbers to swell organically.
The resulting church was thus incredibly diverse. The list of names in Romans 16 reveals a mix of Latin and Greek origins, and many names suggest a background in slavery.
Yet they shared a common heritage, a knowledge of the Mosaic law and the scriptures. Paul tells them, I am speaking to those who know the law in 7.1.
This diversity is what fueled the tensions Paul addresses in depth in chapters 14 and 15, dealing with disputes over Jewish customs, the distinction between the strong and the weak.
The weak were those whose faith led them to maintain strict dietary rules, like vegetarianism, or observe specific holy days.
And this is where the nuance is essential. The strong-weak distinction did not simply follow ethnic lines, did it?
Not at all. Many Gentile Christians, newly converted from paganism, were drawn to Jewish customs for structure and moral clarity, thus becoming the weak. Conversely, some Jewish Christians felt completely free from ceremonial laws constraints, like Paul, and were therefore strong.
So Paul's central goal in those chapters is unity, based on grace, not adherence to ritual. This is an immediate, practical application of his message of divine righteousness to a community struggling with their own internal, social, and ethnic divisions.
And where did these diverse people meet? Well, Paul's greetings in Romans 16 detail a cluster pattern, suggesting the church did not meet in one central location.
Right, he greets at least 7 identifiable groups. The church meeting in Prisca and Aquila's house, groups associated with the households of Aristobulus and Narcissus, and several other small assemblies.
These clusters met in private properties, houses, or apartment blocks. This decentralized pattern would later define the structure of the early Roman church, often leading to titular churches, named after the owners of the private property where the congregation first gathered.
We can deduce the social standing of the church by analyzing the concentrations of Christians in the city. The 3 main areas were Trastevere, Porta Capena, and the Aventine Hill.
Trastevere, across the Tiber, was known for immigrants, dock workers, and the industrial odor from tanning hides, a process that notoriously utilized urine for curing. It was definitely a working-class area.
And the Porta Capena area, where the main eastern roads entered the city, was similarly dominated by transport workers and immigrant groups, including many Jewish beggars.
The Aventine Hill offered a somewhat pleasanter residential area, acting as a bridge between the 2 poorer districts. This geographical distribution shows us the Christians were generally low status, hardworking, often speaking Greek as their primary language, rather than elite Latin.
So you can picture their daily reality. Rising early from a cramped room on the 3rd or 4th floor of an insula, walking down flights of shaky stairs and through narrow, smelly streets to work in the docks or the tanneries. Their assemblies had to fit around this strenuous reality.
Meetings would likely occur on Sunday, either very early before the shops on the ground floor opened or in the evening. They would gather in an upper room of a larger house, or perhaps a rented space.
And we know that later Christians, like Justin Martyr, assembled above the baths of Martinus, suggesting they used whatever functional large spaces they could rent or borrow.
It makes sense, then, that if a large group wanted to hear a lengthy, formal letter like Romans, the small house church clusters might converge. It would be a half-hour walk from Trastevere or Porta Capena up to a wealthier Christian's courtyard on the Aventine Hill, a small effort to hear a crucial message of unity and salvation.
Okay, let's turn to Paul himself. We are confident the letter was composed from Corinth during a 3-month stay, likely in the winter of AD 56-57.
The internal evidence is very strong for that. Phoebe, who was chosen to carry this letter, hailed from Cenchreae, which was the port of Corinth, only 7 miles away.
And the greetings included Gaius, Paul's host, and Erastus, the city's director of public works, names that are firmly associated with Paul's ministry in Corinth.
At this point, Paul viewed his apostolic work in the Eastern Mediterranean as finished. He had preached the gospel extensively, from Jerusalem all the way around to Illyricum.
The coast across the Adriatic.
Exactly. His sights were now firmly fixed west, Rome, and then Spain. He was planning his great transition.
But before he could launch that next phase, he had an immediate, critical task: delivering the financial relief aid, the alms that the Gentile churches in Macedonia and Achaia had collected for the poverty-stricken Jewish Christians in Jerusalem.
And this collection was so much more than mere charity. Paul saw it as a profound theological act. It was essential for demonstrating the unity of the church and showing the spiritual debt that the Gentile believers owed to Israel, the source of their salvation traditions. It was reconciliation acted out.
So, knowing all this, that the Roman Church was established, famous, and that he was about to risk his life going to Jerusalem, why did Paul write such a lengthy, complex exposition of the gospel to a church he'd never personally visited?
Well, the answer rests on four intertwined reasons, all rooted in his current journey and his future plans.
The first reason, and perhaps the primary one, was apostolic counsel. Paul felt a responsibility to the primarily Gentile Roman Church. He wanted to strengthen and encourage them in their faith, fulfilling his calling as the apostle to the Gentiles.
Right. This spiritual gift he wanted to share included specific, gospel-based advice regarding how to live in that hostile imperial context, which is what we see in chapters 12 and 13.
How do they behave toward the governing authorities? How do they avoid conforming to the world?
And crucially, how do they address the internal tensions over Jewish customs, which are the subject of chapters 14 and 15?
Then the second reason was intensely practical, support for Spain.
Yes, Paul planned for Rome to be his launch pad. He needed their help, not just moral support, but actual assistance for the journey. When he speaks of being sent on, he is asking for companions, food, money, and means for sea travel to launch the Spanish mission.
Okay, and the third reason was immediate and urgent, a prayer request.
Extremely urgent. Paul knew his mission to Jerusalem was fraught with danger, both from hostile Jews and suspicious Roman officials who might misinterpret the purpose of the collection. He urgently asked the Roman Christians to pray for his success and safety.
And the fourth reason?
Finally, the subordinate but crucial reason was a defense of the gospel. Since Paul had never been to Rome, he knew his teaching was often misrepresented by opponents. He faced charges that he promoted lawlessness or encouraged sin so that grace could increase, which he mentions in Romans 3:8.
So he needed to provide a comprehensive, nuanced account of the gospel. He had to show how, despite the radical nature of justification by faith, his message fundamentally honored Israel's scriptures and traditions.
Right. He uses the letter to preemptively defend against misrepresentations, such as the sharp contrast he draws between the inability of the law and the abundance of grace in chapters 5, 6, and 7.
And while Paul addresses all who are in Rome, he writes with remarkable clarity and detail. This level of theological exposition suggests he was aware that unbelievers and curious inquirers frequently attended Christian assemblies.
We know this was the case in other places, like Corinth.
So this is a critical insight into the letter's function. Paul employs a rhetorical device, the fictional, unbelieving Jewish interlocutor in places like Romans 2 and 3 to instruct believers.
But the very detail and clarity of the gospel exposition mean it was designed to function as initial preaching. It suggests the letter was designed not just for internal instruction, but as a compelling, persuasive proclamation directed at anyone who might be listening in the room.
As we wrap up this deep dive into the context, we encounter one of the most surprising historical facts about this text: its physical form.
It's really fascinating. By the mid-2nd century, Romans was circulating in both the 16-chapter version we read today and its significantly shorter 14-chapter form.
So we don't possess a complete surviving manuscript of the short version. We have to rely on indirect witnesses, right? Which forces us to reconstruct the argument.
Exactly. The most important witness is Origen, the great Alexandrian scholar writing in the mid-3rd century. He confirms the existence of the shorter text.
And he noted that Marcion, a controversial figure from the mid-2nd century known for his anti-Jewish theological edits, had certainly removed the final doxology and cut everything from 14.23 onward.
Which would fit his agenda. Marcion's goal was to strip Christianity of its Jewish roots, so deleting chapters about Jewish-Gentile unity and Paul's specific mission to Jerusalem and Spain makes perfect sense for him.
But here is the stunning detail that Origen provided. He knew of other copies of Romans, copies that were clearly not influenced by Marcion, which placed that final doxology right after 14.23.
This leads to the logical inference. If the universal praise of the doxology was attached directly to 14.23, it strongly suggests that the text in front of those scribes simply ended at that point. The letter concluded with the moral imperatives of unity.
Which means Marcion didn't necessarily invent the short edition. He inherited it and then likely exploited it for his own theological purposes.
And that's supported by other external evidence. For instance, Tertullian, who wrote against Marcion, never quotes from chapters 15 or 16 and seems only to have known the 14-chapter version of Romans.
And there's more, isn't there? The old Latin summary of Romans.
Right. This summary skips straight from discussing the moral content of chapter 14 to the final doxology in 16.2527. This confirms that the author of that summary worked with a manuscript that physically attached the doxology right to the end of chapter 14.
So we have multiple independent lines of evidence pointing to a legitimate non-Marcionite tradition of a short text. The question is, why would such an important portion of Paul's argument, chapters 15 and 16, be deleted in the early transmission?
Well, the leading suggestion is the theory of universalization. The idea is that at a very early stage, someone sought to make Romans applicable to all churches across the empire, not just the specific ethnically divided congregation in Rome.
To make the letter universal, they removed the specific geographic references. This meant deleting mentions of Rome in 1.7 and 1.15.
And crucially, it meant removing the last two chapters, 15 and 16.
Because chapters 15 and 16 contain Paul's specific travel plans, his mission to Jerusalem and Spain, commendation of Phoebe from Cenchreae, and the enormous localized list of personal greetings.
All of those details were only relevant to the immediate local readers in Rome. By deleting them, you transform the letter from a piece of localized apostolic correspondence and missionary planning into a pure, sweeping theological and ethical treatise.
So chapters 1 through 14 stand alone as the most coherent explanation of sin, law, grace, justification, and Christian living.
And we see clear physical evidence of this universalized text in manuscripts like Codex Bornerianus. G. That codex omits the word Rome in the salutation, reading, "To all who are in the love of God," instead of "to all who are in Rome."
And it supplies chapters 15 and 16 at the very end, almost as a separate appendix.
This arrangement suggests the scribe originally possessed a universalized 14-chapter text and only later added the final two chapters from a separate source, recognizing their apostolic origin but treating them as distinct from the main theological body of work.
So the textual history itself reveals that even the earliest Christian communities recognized the universal applicability of Paul's doctrine in Romans 1 through 14.
So much so that they were willing to sacrifice the personal context and missionary planning of Paul's conclusion to make the doctrine immediately relevant to every gathering across the Mediterranean world.
We began this deep dive by contrasting two visions of righteousness. On one side, the Roman Empire, built on the ruthless, zero-sum game of survival, where conquest was justified by a false claim of divine honor.
And human life was measured dismissively between works of art and beasts of burden.
And on the other side, we see Paul's letter arriving in the imperial nerve center, addressed to diverse, low-status people, immigrants, former slaves, and workers struggling to maintain unity in smelly, cramped neighborhoods.
His message was one of grace-centered justification and divine righteousness, a complete moral and theological inversion of Rome's pride.
And Paul gives this fragmented, diverse church a comprehensive theology designed to bind them together, focusing on unity between the weak and the strong, because the gospel provides a common justification that levels all ethnic and social distinctions.
He shows them that true peace is not the Pax Romana achieved through military domination, but the peace of justification found through faith in Christ, which addresses the root problem of universal sin.
Here is a final thought for you to carry forward. We have seen that Paul intentionally composed Romans expecting a mixed audience, both committed Christians in house churches and potentially unbelieving inquirers who attended their assemblies.
This deliberate clarity means the letter is designed not just for established theological instruction, but as a compelling, persuasive argument directed toward the unsaved.
So what might it look like for us today to approach Romans, not just as a text for our own spiritual guidance, but as a proclamation, a piece of initial persuasive preaching designed for the curious listener or skeptic who might be standing right next to us?
A lot to think about.
This has been The Deep Dive, powered by Reformed Thinking. We trust that this context provides you with renewed clarity as you engage with the Apostle Paul's crucial letter.
Until next time.